whether he really will face federal charges, and if so, whether those have anything at all to do with his involvement with the Trump Organization and Donald Trump, or whether those are just his own personal financial business issues.
And the fact is, if you're going to get yourself out of legal jeopardy when you're facing charges, you have to offer something of value, right? You can't just sort of nicely say, well, I'm going to tell the truth now.
No, yes, that's something of value, and that's why I continue to question what this public drawing out of information that he might have, how that serves his interests. Because if you really have information of value and you really want to cooperate with prosecutors, the way to do that is to do it quietly through your lawyer to the U.S. Attorney's Office, not in a public forum.
Well, I think it's also true. He's just pissed. I mean, he's just, no, I mean, he just doesn't like the way he's being treated by Trump and the people around Trump, and he wants to sort of strike back at that. And, you know, people are, you may have known this, Jim, they're human beings. Yes. And they get angry and they get offended and they get hurt. And that's also a factor going on here.
Nia Malika, if I could switch gears here, because lots of news today. The president pardoned two men today, two ranchers, who were at the center of really a violent conflict with federal authorities. They lit fire to federal land. By doing that, they threatened the lives of some federal officers there. And the president here pardoning them. Why?
Well, because it's something that his base likes. It's something that his base has been talking about. It's something that the White House has said these two men, for instance, they essentially served their time. They feel like they had gotten too much time. I think it was 4 years and 3 years for another one. He has been issuing essentially political pardons, right? Sheriff Joe Arpaio would be on that list. Scooter Libby would be on that list. Dinesh D'Souza as well. And then he has also issued pardons because sort of famous people have told him to. Under that,
Stallone,
Stallone, of course, with Jack Johnson and Alice Marie Johnson as well. Kim Kardashian pleaded with him, and as a result, she got her sentence commuted. And so that's what we've seen. I mean, sort of more broadly, I think people see this as Trump obviously liking to kind of wave his magic wand and issue a pardon. He likes exercising that power, and whether or not he's kind of signaling something else to all these folks who are involved with the Russian investigation.
As the president is at least involved in an investigation, Jeffrey Toobin, and people close to him have been charged with crimes, would we be doltish not to conclude that the president is also signaling some of those folks, reminding them that he has the ability to pardon them?
Yeah, no other president in recent American history has used the pardon in this way. There used to be, and I guess there still is, this very orderly process for applying to the Justice Department for a pardon, you know, a lengthy review process. It's not required, but it's just how the presidents have done it. This has been kind of a seat-of-the-pants operation where he pardons his friends or his friends of his friends. If you are Paul Manafort, if you are even Michael Cohen, though they are in straitened relations right now, you might think, I'm next on the list, and I don't really have to worry about going to prison because he'll take care of me.
Well, that's why when you have these comments from Michael Cohen, and as you say, Kerry, this unusual kind of public airing of all these legal issues and questions and so on, to imagine that there's some signaling back about, hey, how about me for a pardon?
There might be. On one hand, it may be that the president has found this one narrow area of executive authority that is unchecked, and he has grasped onto that particular authority. It's also interesting coming the day after the Kavanaugh appointment, nomination to the Supreme Court, because Brett Kavanaugh really is a mainstream conservative Republican who could have been nominated by any Republican president, really. And this particular pardon does seem tailored to a particular populist base of the president. And so I just find it a little bit of interesting that they took place the next day.
Throw a bone. That's a smart point.
But I think it's possible.
All right, Kerry, Jeffrey, Nia Malika, as always, thanks very much. Coming up, President Trump soon landing in Brussels for the NATO summit. Why?
With me, President Trump will be touching down shortly in Brussels for an international gathering of NATO and what is set to be a contentious meeting with U.S. allies. Just before taking off, the president took fresh aim at NATO members for not meeting targets for defense spending. Just to be clear here, the countries in this alliance are the historic friends of the United States, but it appears the president might be in more comfortable in enemy territory. Yes, the president is meeting with British Prime Minister Theresa May today and the Queen, but seems to be most looking forward to his one-on-one sit-down with Russia's Vladimir Putin.
NATO has not treated us fairly, but I think we'll work something out. We pay far too much, and they pay far too little. But we will work it out, and all countries will be happy. So I have NATO, I have the UK, which is in somewhat turmoil, and I have Putin. Frankly, Putin may be the easiest of them all. Who would think?
Let's start there with Jeff Zeleny, our senior White House correspondent who is there in Brussels ahead of the president. Jeff, you know, let's just remind everyone, Putin is accused of interfering in the 2016 election, invading Ukraine, annexing Crimea, and overseeing the assassination of his enemies. Yet, when the president earlier was asked, you know, friend or foe of Putin, he said competitor. I mean, how concerned are our NATO allies over a comment like that?
Well, Brooke, there is no question that the president's summit in Helsinki next Monday with Vladimir Putin is casting a shadow over this NATO meeting, precisely because of what the president said. He essentially confirmed some of the fears and concerns of many U.S. allies here in Brussels who will be gathering for that NATO meeting starting tomorrow by saying it could be the easiest one yet. And perhaps that is true if he decides to not confront Vladimir Putin on election meddling, on any of those matters you just said, on invading Ukraine and Crimea. So he may be right by saying it's the easiest of all if he's just going to listen to Vladimir Putin. But those comments sort of made off the cuff as the president was leaving the White House to fly here, where he's expected to land in the next hour or so, certainly underscored the worry, from U.S. lawmakers as well as allies here. Brooke, there's one central point of NATO. It's a 70-year-old alliance, designed for world peace and security. And there is that concern about Article 5. Article 5, of course, is an attack on one ally, is an attack on all allies. And the president essentially said maybe it's not worth it. Well, Brooke, we should point out the only time that article has been used was after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That's when other allies here in Europe and abroad came to the U.S.'s defense. So certainly that sets the backdrop for the meeting. The president is having several meetings with leaders tomorrow. Certainly that tone we saw from last month in the G7 in Canada when he was lecturing German Chancellor Angela Merkel and others, that is continuing here with a new caveat, of course, that meeting in the offing with Vladimir Putin. Brooke?
Jeff Zeleny, thank you. We'll look for the president landing there next hour. With me to digest all of this, Wolf Blitzer. So, Wolf Blitzer, a pleasure, sir. Nice to have you in New York. What do you make of all these headlines, right? The fact that he is meeting with some of America's closest allies, the situation in the United Kingdom right now is chaotic, and that he is saying Putin may be the easiest of them all.
Yeah, and I think Jeff was exactly right. It may be a very easy meeting if he doesn't raise these sensitive issues. But if the president does go forward, raise the issue of Russia meddling in the U.S. election, the U.S. intelligence community is still concerned. They're about to do the same thing in the midterm elections. If the president avoids that subject or just listens to Putin deny any involvement, then it will be relatively easy. If the president doesn't raise the issue of Crimea and Ukraine, then it will be a relatively easy meeting. But if the president raises those sensitive issues, it could be a rather tough meeting. But I think the president does have a good point in saying that the meetings with the NATO allies will be very strained, very tough as well. And as you correctly point out, there's a lot of political uncertainty right now in the UK.
I want to come back to Helsinki because I know you're going there next week. But the frustration with NATO that we've heard from the president time and time again is on money, right? He feels like other countries aren't paying their fair share. So just let's fact check this. How much are other countries? How much is he exaggerating?
Well, the fact is the United States devotes a lot more to defense than the other NATO allies, at least most of them, about 4% of GDP. And you can take a look, 3.57 for the United States, Greece 2.36. But you go down to Germany, 1.24. The commitment of the NATO allies is supposed to be at least 2% of their GDP going to defense. And the president, and to reach that level by 2024, some period along the next several years. But the president has been very angry at the NATO allies for at least 30 years because he thinks the U.S. is spending too much on NATO security, NATO defense. The European allies spending way too little. And I went back. I interviewed him many times over the years. He was always railing against NATO. But I found this little clip. This is with our own Larry King back in 1987.
Wow.
Listen to what Donald Trump, then private citizen, said then.
Okay.
But these are countries that people understand the kind of wealth we're talking about, and I will single them out, but there are many other countries and taking tremendous advantage of this, including NATO. If you look at the payments that we're making to NATO, they're totally disproportionate with everybody else's, and it's ridiculous.
So he's singing the same tune.
Yeah, exactly the same tune. For 30 years, he says the United States is getting ripped up by the NATO allies. And then lately, well, it's not even lately, over these many, many years, he also combines that with the fact that the U.S. has a trade deficit with the European Union, with the European countries, and he thinks the United States has just been a sucker all of these years. So that's a sensitive issue that's going to come up at the meetings at the NATO summit, and I'm sure it's going to cause a lot of anxiety, just as the G7 had a lot of anxiety.
So looking past that, and you mentioned the Putin-Trump summit, right? You're going to Helsinki for this meeting next week, and you mentioned Crimea, you mentioned Syria. What about meddling? What do you think will be the biggest headline?
Well, a lot of people expect that the president will work out some sort of understanding with Putin on Syria. The Russians have an enormous amount of influence on the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. The Iranians have been deeply involved in Syria together with their allies, Hezbollah. The U.S. wants
for children. These supposed day